Welcome to the Film Box. Let's get into it. There's something about a story built on the question of whether love can survive guilt. Not just ordinary guilt, but the kind that costs someone everything, that stays with you long after the credits roll. And that is exactly the box we are opening today. Reminders of Him arrived in cinemas in March 2026, carrying the full weight of a best selling novel, the hopes of a fiercely devoted readership, and the kind of production energy that comes when the original author refuses to leave the room. I watched this film. I sat with it. I thought about it for days. And I came back here with a lot to say. Not all of it is praise. Some of it is frustration. But all of it is honest. Because that's what we do at the Film Box. We don't just describe what's on the screen. We open it up and look at what's underneath. So if you're ready, let's open this one together. Here is the thing about reminders of him that stops you from dismissing it before you've even started. This is not just another book to film adaptation, where a publisher hands over the rights and a studio runs the story through a formula. The author of the novel, Colleen Hoover herself, sat down and wrote the screenplay. She co-authored it, she produced it, she was in the room at every stage. That almost never happens. And what that single fact does is raise the question immediately. If the person who created the story had full creative control over its adaptation, why does the final film feel like something got lost along the way? That tension between what the story could have been and what it actually is on screen is the heartbeat of everything we are going to unpack today. Let's begin before the story. Let's begin where every film really begins, with the decisions made before a single camera rolled. Vanessa Caswill was announced as director of Reminders of Him in December 2024, and the choice tells you something important about what this film was always intended to be. Caswill previously directed Love at First Sight for Netflix, a romantically stylized, emotionally gentle film that leaned into warmth and visual tenderness rather than dramatic edge. She also has experience with the Little Women miniseries, which means she has spent real time adapting beloved literary source material into intimate, character centered storytelling. So, on paper, she was a natural fit for this project. The question the film eventually forces you to ask is whether a director whose signature is restraint and gentleness was quite the right match for a story that demands, at its center, the raw, jagged experience of a woman who caused the death of someone she loved. The casting process reportedly was intense. Maika Monroe came aboard in March 2012, and according to interviews, her attachment to the project came first, before several other major cast members were confirmed. This matters because it means the entire ensemble was built around her interpretation of Kenna, and when you watch the film, you feel that clearly. Monroe's Kenna is the gravitational center of every scene she occupies, and the film leans on her completely. Now, what's fascinating about that choice, and here's where it gets layered, is that Maika Monroe is not an actress you immediately associate with romantic drama. Her most prominent work before this, Long Legs It Follows, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, is rooted in psychological tension and quiet dread. She brought something into this film that the source material arguably needed more of, an undercurrent of real unease beneath the surface of grief. Whether that was a directorial decision or a product of Monroe's own instincts is something we'll return to. Now let's talk about the detail that almost no one mentions when discussing this film, and it genuinely changes how you experience a specific sequence about the 30 minutes in. Principal photography for Reminders of Him took place in Calgary, Canada, not Wyoming, where the story is actually set. This kind of location substitution is common enough in studio productions, but what makes it interesting here is the specific visual challenge it creates. The novel's Wyoming setting is not just a backdrop, it is a character in itself, open, isolated, the kind of landscape where a person feels simultaneously exposed and invisible, which is exactly how Kenna feels every moment she is back in that town. Cinematographer Tim Ives reportedly worked carefully with Caswill to find locations in and around Calgary that could carry that same quality of wide, unforgiving space. There is a recurring visual motif in the film, wide exterior shots where Kenna is filmed from a distance, small against the horizon, and knowing that this was constructed in a different country, sculpted deliberately to feel like the novel's emotional landscape, makes you appreciate the craft involved. When you watch those shots, you are watching a crew actively build the feeling of a place that exists somewhere else entirely. The third fact that reshapes your viewing experience is Lainey Wilson. This Grammy winning country music artist makes a feature film acting debut in Reminders of Him as Amy Matthews, one of the supporting characters who orbits the bar world of Ledger's life. According to interviews, Wilson had never acted in a film before this project, and her casting was reportedly influenced by the film's deep investment in its musical identity. The soundtrack was always going to carry significant emotional weight, and having someone from the world of country music embedded within the cast itself created an organic connection between the story and the sound of it. Tom Howe composed the film's original score, and the way the score interacts with a country inflected musical atmosphere is one of the quieter pleasures of the film. Wilson acquits herself well on screen. She is natural, unpretentious, and brings a grounded warmth to her scenes that functions almost like a tonal anchor for the lighter moments. But here's what the detail really tells you. The filmmakers understood from the beginning that the emotional register of the story needed to feel rooted in something working class, warm, and unguarded. Country music is not decorative here, it is atmospheric. It sets the frequency the whole film is trying to tune into. The fourth piece of behind the scenes context is the one that generated the most discussion before the film even released. Colleen Hoover did not just hand her novel to screenwriters and step back. She co-wrote the screenplay herself alongside Lauren Levine, and she produced the film. That level of audience involvement in an adaptation is almost without precedent in mainstream studio filmmaking. It creates a very specific creative dynamic, one where the decisions made on the page come from the person who knows these characters at their deepest. But it also raises structural question that the film's critical reception ended up surfacing directly. When you are the creator of a story and you adapt it yourself, is it possible to be too close to see what needs to change for the new medium? The novel, Reminders of Him, operates heavily in Kenna's interior voice. Her thoughts, her self recrimination, her poetry, the intimate monologue of a woman living inside her own guilt, is a foundational part of how the book works emotionally. Translating that interior voice into visible cinematic behavior is one of the hardest challenges any adaptation faces, and it is the place where this film most visibly struggles. We will return to this when the story is in front of us. The fifth and final production fact to carry with you: the all female creative leadership behind this film is not incidental to what it is trying to say. Director Vanessa Caswill, producers Colleen Hoover, Lauren Levine, and Gina Matthews. The core creative team is entirely women. Gina Matthews is the producer who brought 13 going on 30, and isn't it romantic to screen films that share a quality of emotional optimism balanced against real emotional stakes? And what that collective sensibility produces in Reminders of Him is a film that consistently chooses grace over shock and empathy over judgment, even when the story is operating in genuinely dark territory. The result is a film that is sometimes almost too gentle, with material that might have been more powerful if it had been allowed to breathe harder. But it also produces a film that never sensationalizes its trauma, and in a landscape where stories about addiction, grief, and lost custody are frequently used for spectacle, that restraint deserves credit. Now that you understand how the box was built, let's open it properly. Reminders of Him is a 2026 American romantic drama directed by Vanessa Caswill and based on Colleen Hoover's 2022 novel of the same name, which has sold more than 6 million copies in the United States alone and has been translated into 45 languages. The film stars Maika Monroe as Kenna Rowan, T.D. Withers as Ledger Ward, Rudy Pankow as Scotty Landry, Lainey Wilson as Amy Matthews, Lauren Graham and Bradley Whitford as Scotty's parents, Grace and Patrick Landry and Nicholas Duvernay. It is distributed by Universal Pictures and carries a PG-13 rating for a combination of mature thematic content, including addiction, grief, and loss, alongside some language and brief partial nudity. The film runs at 1 hour and 54 minutes. At its heart, This is a story about whether a person can be forgiven, not by others, but by themselves, and whether love has the capacity to reach across the worst possible thing a human being has ever done. It is a grief story wearing the costume of a romance, and that distinction matters enormously when you are deciding how to feel about it. Now, should you watch it? Here is the spoiler free verdict, and I want to be honest with you. If you have read the novel and you love Colleen Hoover's emotional frequency, you will find a great deal to appreciate here. Maika Monroe gives a performance that is, at times, genuinely stunning in its stillness. The film is beautiful to look at. It handles serious subject matter with consistent care. But if you are coming in without that existing affection for the source material, and if you need a film to earn your emotions completely on its own terms, you may find yourself at a slight remove from what is happening on screen. The story works. The emotion is often real, but certain connections feel compressed, certain turns feel convenient, and the film's emotional climax arrives at a pace that does not always feel fully earned. At 6.3 out of 10 for me personally, this is a film I respect more than I love. A genuinely competent, often moving piece of storytelling that carries a story bigger than its own runtime and occasionally shows it. We'll dig into all of that. But first, let me tell you what it felt like to watch it for the first time. I want to be honest about what I brought into the cinema with me. I knew the novel's reputation. I knew the audience it had built. And I had watched in recent years the wave of Colleen Hoover adaptations begin to crest. It Ends With Us came before this, and Regretting You, and with each one there was this conversation about whether the emotional intensity that makes her novels compelling could survive the translation to a 2 hour screen experience. So I walked in with a genuine question in my mind. Not a prejudice, a question. Can this specific story, with its very specific emotional architecture, actually work as a film? The opening sequence did something unexpected. It did not begin where I thought it would. It does not open in the present. It opens in the past, in the brief, bright window of Kenna and Scotty's relationship before everything collapsed. And the choice to begin there, in warmth and ordinary joy, rather than in aftermath and consequence, is either one of the film's smartest decisions or one of its most frustrating ones, depending on how patient you are. For me, in those first minutes, it was a smart decision because it asks you to love something before you understand what losing it costs. It creates the emotional baseline against which everything else in the film is measured. The chemistry between Monroe and Rudy Pankow in those early scenes is light, believable, and genuinely sweet. You buy what they are before you understand what happens to it. And then the film cuts forward in time and the warmth is gone, and what is left is Kenna, alone, worn, carrying something enormous, and you feel the weight of that cut in your chest. That is good filmmaking. That is a director who understands the power of contrast. The world this film creates is quiet and deliberately unglamorous. This is not a romance of beautiful apartments and aspirational fashion choices. Kenna's world when she returns to Wyoming, to the town where Scotty was loved and where she is regarded as the person who took him away, is cramped and grey and weighted with the stares of strangers who know her face and her history. She rents a room in a modest motel. She works a waitressing job she can barely hold on to. She watches from a distance a child she has never properly known, her own daughter, playing in a yard that is not hers to enter. The atmosphere in these early scenes is extraordinarily effective. There is a low, aching quality to the way the film frames Kenna's outsider status. She moves through spaces where she does not belong, where she is not wanted, where her very presence creates disruption. And what hooked me in those first 10 minutes, genuinely hooked me, was the realization that this film had chosen to make its heroine someone with no easy defense. She did not make a small mistake. She made the worst possible mistake, and the film does not soften that. It holds you in it. The question it poses immediately is not whether you will sympathize with Kenna. The question is whether sympathy is even the right word for what the film is asking you to feel. That ambiguity, that moral complexity at the center of the story, was what kept me fully engaged through the first act. Now let's walk through what happens. So the world is established. The weight is established. The moral question and the heart of the story has been placed firmly in front of you. And the film has earned, in those first 10 minutes, your willingness to stay in the discomfort. Now the story begins to move. And this is where I want you to stay with me. Because the walkthrough of what happens in Reminders of Him is not simply a sequence of events. It is a carefully constructed emotional argument, a case the film makes scene by scene for why a particular kind of person deserves a particular kind of grace. Whether the film ultimately wins that argument is something we'll examine. But understanding what it is trying to do and why every story beat exists is essential to understanding why this film works when it works and where it comes apart at the seams. Let's open this up from the beginning of Kenna's journey back. She is released from prison after serving her sentence for vehicular manslaughter. The film is careful not to over-explain this in dialogue-heavy, expository scenes, but rather to let it emerge gradually, the way the full weight of a past event surfaces slowly in memory. What happened is already common knowledge in the town she is returning to. She does not need to explain herself to strangers. They already know. That is the specific social horror the film is exploring, the way a public crime makes a private person permanently legible to everyone around them. Kenna cannot walk into a diner or a motel lobby or a parking lot without being read, without being judged before she speaks. Maika Monroe carries this in her body in a way that is genuinely impressive. She walks as someone who has learned to take up less space. Her eyes have a quality of constant low-level appraisal, scanning rooms not for opportunity but for threat, for recognition, for the next moment of rejection she is already bracing for. This is physical characterization at a high level, and it is doing storytelling work that the script itself does not always manage. Kenna's first goal when she returns is not romantic. It is singular and consuming. She wants to see her daughter. DM, the child she gave birth to in prison, the child she has never properly known, the child who has been raised entirely by Scotty's parents, Grace and Patrick Landry, in the years since Kenna was incarcerated. The Landrys are not monsters. The film is very deliberate about this, and it is one of its strongest narrative choices. Bradley Whitford and Lauren Graham play Grace and Patrick with a complexity that resists easy categorization. These are people who lost their son. They are not keeping DM from Kenna out of abstract cruelty. They are keeping DM from Kenna because they genuinely believe that Kenna represents danger. Not physical danger, emotional danger. The danger of instability, of reappearance, of a child who has built a settled life suddenly being asked to integrate the complicated reality of a mother who is a stranger and a criminal history that will at some point need to be explained. Lauren Graham, in particular, finds a register of grief adjacent hostility that is quietly devastating to watch. This is not the warm, verbal, sparkling energy she brought to Gilmore Girls. This is a woman who has closed certain doors in herself because opening them is unbearable, and Graham communicates that closure in the set of her jaw and the measured precision of every word she speaks to Kenna. You understand why she is the way she is. You wish she were different. That tension is exactly what the film needs from that character, and Graham delivers it. Kenna cannot get near them. Every approach is rebuffed. Every attempt at communication is shut down. She takes a job at a local diner, partly for income, partly to stay in proximity to the life she is trying to rebuild access to. And she settles into a kind of watchful stasis. She can see DM from across streets, from behind car windows, from the careful distance of someone who knows she does not yet have the right to close the gap. These scenes of observation are among the film's most emotionally precise. There is a specific quality of longing in them that does not require any words. Monroe's face in those moments is an entire interior novel compressed into a look. She is not performing grief. She is performing restraint in the presence of grief. And that distinction, that visible effort to contain an overwhelming feeling rather than express it, is what makes those scenes land harder than any conventional weeping sequence could. And then she meets Ledger Ward, Now, here is where the story's most interesting complication lives, and here is what I want you to understand before the film shows you the full shape of it. Kenna does not walk into Ledger's bar knowing who he is. She does not sit across from him aware that the man mixing drinks and looking at her with a combination of wariness and something that might be curiosity was Scotty's closest friend. The connection is unknown to her at first, and that unknowing, the fact that she can be genuinely, unguardedly present with him in a way she cannot be with anyone else in this town, is the specific emotional engine that makes their relationship feel real before it becomes complicated. Derek Withers plays Ledger with an interesting quality of suppressed conflict. He is a man who knows exactly who Kenna is before she realizes he knows. He knows what she did. He was Scotty's best friend. He loved Scotty. He watched what Scotty's death did to the landrise, to Diem's early life, to the community around him. And yet, something in the way Kenna presents herself to the world, something in the visible weight of a person who has not been forgiven and has not forgiven herself, reaches him in a way he clearly does not expect and does not know how to process. Look closer at the early scenes between Kenna and Ledger, because this is where the film is doing some of its most careful work. Their first real conversations happen in the bar, in the low light and the ambient noise of a working class local pub. And Caswill is smart enough to understand that intimacy in these settings has a particular texture. You are not alone with someone in a bar. You are alone adjacent. You can be honest in ways that a kitchen table or a front porch would not permit, because there is always the fiction of impermanence available to you, the understanding that you could walk away at any moment, and so the things you say feel slightly less permanent and therefore slightly safer to say. Kenna tells Ledger things in those early bar scenes that she has not told anyone else in this town. Not because she trusts him specifically, she doesn't yet, but because the social context makes honesty feel less dangerous than it does everywhere else. And Withers plays Ledger's reception of those confidences with a controlled discomfort that is doing a lot of quiet work. He is receiving information about a person he already has a relationship with, one of guilt and grief and complicated loyalty, and he is receiving it from the mouth of the person he already knows is at the center of that grief. The internal conflict in Ledger in those early scenes is visible without being announced. That is strong acting. The moment of revelation, when both characters understand who the other truly is this film's first major pivot. It happens with a restraint that some viewers found frustrating and that I actually found quietly correct. It is not a screaming confrontation, it is not a dramatic unmasking. It is a gradual mutual understanding that settles over a conversation like weather arriving. You can feel it coming before it arrives, and when it does, the atmosphere changes in ways that are more felt than visible. What the film does with this moment is to hold it rather than explode it. Ledger knows before Kenna realizes he knows. Kenna begins to suspect before she directly addresses it. And the space between suspicion and confrontation is where the film generates some of its most genuinely tense dramatic energy. Because both characters understand in that space that everything they have begun to feel for each other is about to be tested against everything they already know about each other's history. That is a genuinely rich dramatic situation. The question is whether the film makes enough of it. Picture this moment, Kenna, sitting in that bar at a late hour when the other customers have cleared, and Ledger's face shifts, not dramatically, not into anger exactly, but into something more like the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight in one direction and just felt it shift. He tells her not with cruelty but with a kind of exhausted directness who he is in relation to Scotty. He makes clear that he already knows who she is. He makes clear that he has known for some time, and what Monroe does in the seconds after that revelation is extraordinary. There is no theatrical collapse, no immediate tearful response. Instead, there is a stillness that is somehow louder than anything else could be. A stillness that says, I knew something like this was coming. I knew I could not have something good without it costing me something I can't afford. That stillness is the emotional signature of this film at its best. It is the sound of a person who has learned not to be surprised by the world's refusal to let her rest. What follows is a period of distance, a necessary rupture between the two characters after the full weight of their connection to Scotty and to DM is out in the open. And this section of the film is where certain pacing issues begin to be felt. The novel uses Kenna's interior voice, her poetry, her direct addresses to Scotty's memory, to navigate this emotional distance, to keep the reader connected to her inner world, even when the external action is relatively subdued. The film does not have that interior voice to fall back on. There are moments where it reaches for visual equivalence. Long shots of Kenna in her motel room, a journal seen briefly, a pen in her hand, but these glimpses are not given enough screen time to fully replace the function of the prose. What results is a middle section of the film that occasionally feels like it is marking time rather than moving through it, following characters who are feeling things that the camera cannot quite find a way to show us clearly enough. But then, and this is the moment the box opens completely, Ledger makes a choice. He chooses Kenna, not romantically yet. He chooses her as a human being worthy of advocacy. He begins, quietly and without announcement, to work on Grace and Patrick. He does not argue on Kenna's behalf in grand gestures or speeches. He does it the way real influence works, in small, consistent accumulations of perspective, in the gentle, repeated insertion of a different way of seeing the same person. He reminds Grace and Patrick not of what Kenna did. They do not need reminding, but of what Deem is going to need as she grows into a person who can ask questions. He creates gradually a fracture in their resistance, not a surrender, a fracture, and it is in watching Ledger operate in this way, not as a romantic hero sweeping in to solve a problem, but as a flawed person trying to do a right thing in a situation where there are no clean answers, that Tyrek Withers does some of his most affecting work. The romance between Kenna and Ledger does not accelerate in a conventional way. There is no single scene where the film announces they are now together. This is the couple, root for them. Instead, the relationship is assembled from proximity and honesty and the specific intimacy of two people who have no one else in the same radius who can truly understand what they are carrying. They are each, in a sense, a reminder of him, of Scotty, and the romantic charge between them is inseparable from that shared grief. This is actually the novel's most psychologically interesting idea, and in the film's better moments, it comes through clearly. The relationship is not a distraction from the grief, it is an expression of it. Two people who love the same person in different ways, finding each other in the space his absence created. That is not a conventional romance. That is a story about how grief and love occupy the same emotional territory, how the presence of one does not preclude the possibility of the other. There are scenes between Monroe and Withers that achieve a genuine emotional altitude. There is a sequence, late in the second act, where Kenna and Ledger are together in a setting that feels suspended from the rest of the town's judgment, and the conversation they have is not about Scotty, not about Dean, not about any of the external pressures bearing down on them, but about the external pressures bearing down on them, but about ordinary things, ordinary desires. What they would want for themselves if the world were different, if their histories were different. And in those few minutes of imagined ordinary life, the film does something quietly devastating. It shows you exactly what these two characters would be to each other in a world without the weight they are carrying. And then it lets you feel the full mass of that weight return. That is sophisticated emotional filmmaking. It does not happen often enough in this film, but when it does, it is undeniable. The conflict with the Landrys reaches a critical point when DM, still very young, still a child being sheltered from information she does not yet have the tools to process, begins to demonstrate a curiosity about her mother that Grace and Patrick cannot indefinitely suppress. The film handles this with a delicacy that reflects the all-female creative team's instinct to protect the child's perspective within the story. DM is not presented as a pawn. She is presented as a person in the earliest stages of becoming, with her father's warmth and someone else's unquiet eyes. And every scene she is in is approached with the understanding that the most vulnerable person in this entire moral situation is the one who had no choice in any of it. The young actress playing DM brings a natural, unperformed quality to these scenes that keeps them from becoming sentimental. There is a particular moment between DM and a small animal, the kitten subplot that online audiences have made much of, that works precisely because it is not played for cuteness. It is played for the specific quality of gentle, instinctive care that a child shows when she has been shown gentle, instinctive care herself. It tells you everything about how Grace and Patrick have raised her, even as it tells you something about what DM carries in her genetic inheritance without knowing it. Bradley Whitford's Patrick is the Landry who bends first, and his art is the more internally complex of the two because his resistance to Kenna is rooted not in active hostility but in a kind of paralysis. His immense grief has made him afraid of further loss, and his protection of DM from Kenna is, in some part, his protection of himself from having to face the full complexity of his son's story. Whitford communicates this without a single scene of explicit psychological confession. It is in the way he listens to Ledger, in the way he watches DM, in the particular quality of stillness he carries in scenes where Kenna's name is spoken, as if waiting for the feeling to subside before he trusts himself to respond. He does not have many scenes in this film, something we'll address in the weaknesses section, but in every scene he's given, he makes a specific, precise, unmistakable choice. That is the work of an actor who has thought carefully about where this person comes from, not just where the script tells him to go. The film's final act brings these threads together in a way that is emotionally satisfying in broad shape but occasionally rushed in specific execution. Kenna is given an opportunity, an opening hard won and fragile, to meet the M, and the film bears toward this moment with genuine patience. The actual encounter between Kenna and DM is the film's emotional centerpiece, and it is where Maika Monroe gives the performance of her career in this particular project. What the scene requires of her is the ability to be overwhelmed without losing control, to contain inside a composed exterior the full force of a love that has had nowhere to go for years, because the object of that love has been, for all that time, unreachable. Monroe threads this needle with a technical precision that is breathtaking if you are watching closely enough. The moment she sees the aim properly, at close range, for the first time, there is a breath, just a breath, and then she very deliberately pulls herself back from the full expression of what she is feeling, because she knows that unleashing it would terrify this child, because she has spent years learning that what she feels cannot be the first thing she asks other people to manage, and that understanding that Kenna's love for her daughter is so enormous it must be hidden in order to be kind, is the most quietly devastating idea the film offers, and Monroe finds it completely. What follows is not a fairy tale resolution. The film is honest enough, and the source material is honest enough, and Colleen Hoover's authorship of the screenplay is protecting enough to avoid the simplification of a clean, happy ending. What Kenna gets is not everything. It is a beginning, a fracture in a wall that has been built against her for years. A first conversation with a child who does not yet know the full weight of what she is being asked to accept. And the film ends not with the problem solved but with the problem made human sized. Still difficult, still unresolved in all its complexity, but no longer impossible. That is the correct ending for this story. Whether the film earns it fully by the time it arrives is, again, a question for the next layer, but the ending itself is right. It asks the audience to sit in the ambiguity of partial forgiveness and partial progress, and it does not flinch from that. Now, let's move to what this film does brilliantly. Because there is real craft here, and it deserves to be named specifically. Maika Monroe is the first, most important, and most thorough answer to that question. She commands every single frame she occupies in this film with an intensity that never tips into performance and never retreats into passivity. What Monroe does with Kenna is something that very few actors at her level would have been willing to do. She makes Kenna genuinely difficult. Not in the sense of being unpleasant on screen. She is never that, but in the sense of being a character who does not invite easy emotional identification. Kenna is not presented as sympathetic in the conventional sense. She does not spend the film explaining herself or seeking absolution in ways the audience can comfortably grant. She spends the film moving through a world that has every reason to reject her, and choosing again and again not to collapse and not to run. That is a character defined by endurance rather than charm, and endurance is genuinely hard to make compelling over the course of nearly 2 hours. Monroe makes it not just compelling but riveting. The specific scene that proves what Monroe is doing at the highest level is the moment I described above, the first meeting with EM. But let me draw your attention to another scene earlier in the film that I think is equally important and has received less attention. There is a sequence in the film where Kenna goes to the cemetery where Scotty is buried and stands there alone. No other characters, no dialogue, just Kenna and the physical fact of Scotty's absence made permanent in stone. Monroe is on screen for nearly 3 minutes in this sequence with nothing to react to, no other actor to play against, and the camera holding close enough that every micro expression is visible. What she does in those 3 minutes is not a performance of grief. It is grief organized, grief that has been lived with long enough that it no longer arrives in waves but simply exists as the permanent background of everything. She is not crying, she is not performing, she is present with a loss in the way that people who have lost someone they truly loved are present with it years later, not dramatically but constantly. That scene is acting at the highest level, and it is not in the trailer. And most people who discuss this film have not mentioned it, and that is the definition of a scene that deserves to be found. In terms of story construction, the film makes one genuinely bold structural decision that I want to give proper credit for. The use of the past, the pre-tragedy Kenna and Scotty, is not confined to the opening sequence. The film returns to these glimpses of the past at specific moments throughout the story, and the timing of those returns is carefully chosen. They do not arrive randomly. They arrive at the moments when Kenna is at her most alone in the present, when the distance between who she was and where she is now is at its widest, and the effect is to make those flashbacks function not as nostalgia or exposition, but as psychological pressure. They are what memory actually does to a person living with enormous regret. It intrudes at the worst moments. It shows you what you have lost, precisely when you can least afford to look at it. That structural choice, using the past as emotional counterpoint to the present rather than as backstory, is a sophisticated piece of screenwriting craft, and it is one of the places where Colleen Hoover and Lauren Levine's screenplay is genuinely doing something more ambitious than a standard adaptation would attempt. Rudy Punkel as Scotty deserves specific attention in this context because his work in these flashback sequences is carrying an enormous amount of weight. Scotty, being dead before the main story begins, exists only in memory, and Pankao has to create a person complete enough that the audience understands what Kenna lost, what the Landrys lost, what Ledger lost, without ever having a scene in the present tense. That is an unusual acting challenge. You are not building a character arc, you are building a portrait, an impression of someone who existed fully and is now entirely gone. Panker does this with a warmth and an unguarded naturalness that makes Scotty feel genuinely beloved rather than merely described. The scenes between him and Monroe in the past are light and physical and easy in the way that real intimacy is easy, and that ease is what makes the contrast with the present so devastating. You understand why Kenna still talks to him. You understand why Ledger still misses him. You understand why Cleese and Patrick have built the entire remaining world around protecting what he left behind. Pankha gives you a person where all of that grief, and without that the whole structure of the film would be emotionally hollow. Now, the direction and visuals. Vanessa Caswill makes specific choices here that are worth examining. The cinematography by Tim Ives consistently uses light as an emotional indicator in ways that are subtle enough to register subconsciously rather than announcing themselves. Kenna's world in the film's present is lit with a low gray naturalism, flat skies, interior spaces lit by practical sources that create shadows rather than eliminating them. The past. The Scotty sequences is warmer, golden edged, with the particular quality of late afternoon light that makes everything look like a memory even when you are in it. This is not a new technique, but its application here is clean and consistent, and it gives the film a visual grammar that the audience can follow intuitively without needing it to be explained. When the film cuts between registers of light, you know immediately which world you are in and which emotional register is being asked of you. That clarity of visual language is a directorial discipline that serves the story well. There is a recurring compositional choice Caswell makes with Monroe, placing Kenna in the frame with significant negative space around her, often with the landscape or an architectural element pressing in from one side that communicates her character's psychological isolation without any dialogue. Kenna is always slightly off center in her own world, always slightly more surrounded by empty space than a character who felt at home would be. These are the kinds of choices that you feel rather than consciously notice on a first watch, and they are doing important emotional work on behalf of the story. The music deserves sustained attention. Tom Howe's original score is one of the genuine pleasures of this film, and it is operating with a sophistication that the critical conversation around reminders of him has largely failed to acknowledge. Howe's approach is to keep the score intimate and acoustic, primarily string based, with moments of piano that have the quality of something heard through a wall rather than in the room. The score does not swell at the emotional peaks in the way that conventional melodrama would use it. It recedes. It becomes quieter at the moments when the emotion is biggest, as if the music itself knows that the feeling already present in Monroe's performance does not need amplification. That restraint is a compositional decision that mirrors the film's broader tonal instinct, and it works. The soundtrack, which integrates country music in a way that feels organic rather than promotional, creates an atmospheric layer of working class Americana that grounds the story's emotional register in a specific cultural world. Lainey Wilson's presence in the cast and the connection between her musical identity and the film's sonic atmosphere creates a coherence between the soundtrack and the narrative world that is rare in this kind of studio production. The one scene that I consider completely unforgettable in this film, the scene that is for me the definitive argument for its existence, is not the scene with DM. It is a quieter scene, shorter, less climactic in the conventional sense. It is the scene where Ledger plays Kenna's song, not a grand romantic gesture, just music in a bar after hours with no audience and no occasion. The song exists because it exists, because Ledger is someone who plays music when he does not know what to say, and because Kenna is someone who has not been offered something beautiful simply because she deserves it for a very long time. What Monroe does in that scene, receiving an uncomplicated gift of beauty after years of operating in a world where beauty was not something she was permitted, is, I think, the emotional core of the entire film. The scene is not in the novel in quite this form. It is, according to some interviews with the production team, a scene that emerged partly through collaborative development with the actors. And it is the scene that justifies everything the film is trying to do. It makes Kenna's humanity visible without explaining it. It makes Ledger's feeling for her visible without dramatizing it. And it makes the audience understand something that takes the rest of the film 2 hours to argue, that what this woman needs most is not forgiveness from a person in authority. What she needs is to be simply uncomplicatedly seen by another human being. That scene. In a film with this many challenges, that scene makes it worth it. Now let's turn to where this film falls short. Because honesty is what this channel is built on, and this film has real problems that its emotional moments do not fully cover. The most significant structural problem in Reminders of Him is the compression of Ledger's internal conflict. The novel spends considerable time, entire chapters stored from Ledger's perspective, building the specific texture of his guilt, his loyalty to Scotty, his initial anger at Kenna, his gradual, reluctant, deeply complicated movement toward her. In the film, this arc exists, but it exists in shorthand. We understand intellectually that Ledger is conflicted. We can see it in Tilly Quidder's performance at the surface level, but the film does not give us enough scenes where that conflict is expressed. challenged, explored, and resolved in real time. What we get instead are ellipses, significant leaps in the emotional logic of Ledger's journey that the film asks us to accept because the previous scene suggested they were coming. That is not the same as watching someone actually arrive somewhere emotionally. The result is that Ledger's decision to fully commit to Kenna feels, on a first watch, slightly accelerated relative to the obstacles the film itself has established. You believe it, partly because Withers says it, but you do not fully feel the full weight of what it cost him because the film has not shown you enough of the cost. The pacing in the second act is the film's second major challenge, and it is connected to the first. When both leads are in that period of distance after the revelation of their connection to Scotty, the film loses momentum in a way that the novel never did because the novel had Kenna's internal voice to fill that space. In the film, the middle section has stretches that feel slow, not in the way slow burn cinema feels slow. Slow with intention, with accumulating tension, but slow in the way that happens when a story is waiting for its next plot development and does not quite know what to do with its characters in the interim. There are scenes that feel like they were in the script because the structural outline required something to happen in this section, not because the emotional logic of the characters demanded them. That is a screenwriting problem, and it is one of the places where Colleen Hoover's closeness to the source material may have worked against her as a screen adapter. It is very difficult to see which scenes can be cut when every scene contains something you know the story needs in novel form. In film form, the economy of storytelling is more unforgiving. Bradley Whitford is criminally underused. I said this briefly during the story walkthrough, but it deserves a full treatment here. Whitford is one of the finest character actors working in American cinema. His work in films like Get Out, where he created something complex, layered, and deeply unsettling, demonstrated an ability to operate in moral ambiguity that this film desperately needs more of from Patrick Landry. The scenes he's given are not bad, they are good, sometimes genuinely affecting, but there are not enough of them. And the ones that exist do not explore the corners of Patrick's grief with the fullness that Whitford could have provided. There is an entire film, a better one, in which Patrick's journey from protective hostility towards something like reluctant grace is given the same screen time as Kenna's. This film does not make that film, it gives us glimpses of it. And every glimpse makes you wish the frame were wider. The logic of the romance, the specific plot mechanism that creates danger for both Kenna and Ledger, is the film's weakest dramatic element, and it is something that reviewers have noted consistently. The threat is real within the story's world. Kenna risks her standing with the Landrise, and Ledger risks the trust of the people who matter to him if their relationship becomes public. But the film does not build this danger with enough specificity to make it genuinely tense in cinematic terms. You are told that the romance poses risks. You see characters be cautious about it. But the actual dramatic machinery of what would happen if the secret were exposed, the specific concrete consequences, is underexplored. The result is that the central tension of the second half of the film, which should be generating genuine suspense, generates instead a mild anxiety that is emotionally unsatisfying relative to the stakes the story implies are pleasant. There is also a missed opportunity in the handling of Kenna's poetry. In the novel, her poetry, her private writings to Scotty, is one of the most distinctive formal elements of the book. It gives Hoover's prose a different texture from her other novels, and it gives Kenna's Inner Life a specific channel of expression that exists outside the conventions of narrative fiction. The film makes reference to Kenna's writing. You see her with a journal. There are moments where the film clearly intends for you to understand that she is still writing, still talking to Scotty on the page. But the actual content of what she writes is almost entirely absent from the screen. There is an argument to be made that this is correct, that reproducing the poetry in voiceover would feel artificial. But there is a counter argument that says the film needed to find some cinematic equivalent for that interior expression, and it never fully does. The gap it leaves is real. It is the gap between a character who is complex and a character who is fully legible. And this film's Kenna lives in the first category for most of its runtime. Finally, the ending, though I will give this much fuller treatment in the spoiler section, has a quality of tidiness that does not entirely match the film's best instincts. The story has spent considerable time in moral ambiguity, in the uncomfortable space of a situation where no one can fully win without someone else losing something. The resolution it offers is generous, correctly generous in my view, but delivered with a slightly too clean emotional signature. The final scenes have the quality of a deep breath out rather than a continuing breath, as if the film is settling into comfort rather than continuing to ask hard questions. The novel's ending has this quality too, but the prose medium gives it an intimacy that makes the comfort feel earned on screen. In wide shots and open ended frames, the same emotional content has the risk of feeling like a formal resolution rather than a lived one. The film gets away with it, partly because Monroe is still working in those final scenes with her earlier precision. But if you are paying close attention, you can feel the story reaching for its landing rather than finding it naturally. None of these weaknesses are fatal. Not one of them makes this a bad film. What they make it is an uneven one, a film with moments of genuine distinction distributed through a structure that does not fully support their weight. A film that is better than its most critical reviews suggest and less impressive than its most devoted audience insists. A film that earns its emotional high points, sometimes strains for them, and occasionally simply does not find what it was looking for. In other words, a human film. A film made by people who cared about the story and its characters, who did not always find the exact right way to express that care on screen, and who nevertheless produce something that contains real feeling, real craft, and at least one performance that belongs in any serious conversation about what Maika Monroe is capable of. So now we understand the film's craft and its cracks. We have walked through what Caswill and Monroe and Withers and the entire team built, and we have been honest about where it holds and where it gives. But before we go deeper into the hidden layers of this story, before we open the full spoiler box and examine every twist and symbol and moment of foreshadowing that most people missed on a first watch, we need to step back from the film itself for a moment and ask a different kind of question. Not what is this film, but what is this film doing in the world right now? What is the cultural moment that produced it, received it, and is still processing it? Because every film arrives into a specific time and place, and understanding that context does not just explain how the audience reacted. It explains why the story was made at all, and why certain elements of it landed the way they did and failed the way they did. This is the layer that most video essays skip over. This is the layer where things get genuinely interesting. Reminders of Him arrived in cinemas on March 13, 2026, and it arrived carrying a weight that had nothing to do with its own story. It arrived as the third major Colleen Hoover theatrical adaptation in recent years, following It Ends With Us and Regretting You. And the cultural conversation around Hoover's work had, by the time this film appeared, become something much larger and much more complicated than a discussion about romance novels. The book talk phenomenon, the TikTok driven literary culture that turned Colleen Hoover from a successful independent author into one of the best selling novelists in the world, had by 2026 produced both an enormous and fiercely devoted readership and a significant critical backlash. There were serious literary critics writing serious essays about what the Hoover phenomenon said about the state of contemporary fiction, about emotional manipulation in popular storytelling, about the relationship between trauma and entertainment. There were devoted readers writing back with equal seriousness about what it meant to find stories that reflected their own experiences of grief, abuse, loss, and complicated love without softening or dismissing those experiences. That argument was ongoing and loud and unresolved when this film walked into it, and the way critics and audiences received reminders of him cannot be fully understood without understanding the temperature of that argument. The novel itself was published in January 2022 at a specific cultural moment. Pandemic isolation was still shaping the emotional landscape of a large portion of the reading public. People were home, they had time, they had an appetite for emotionally intense stories that could transport them entirely into another person's interior world. The book talk community was at the peak of its early explosive growth, and reminders of him. A story about a woman in isolation, separated from the people she loves by a wall that society has constructed around her and that she cannot tear down alone, had a particular resonance with an audience that had spent 2 years experiencing their own versions of enforced separation and the grief of inaccessible connection. The novel sold 6 million copies in the United States. It was translated into 45 languages. It became the kind of cultural object that gets discussed not just as a book but as an experience, something people read and then needed to talk about, needed to process with other people who had read it, needed to share as an act of emotional communion. By the time the film arrived 4 years later, the cultural movement had shifted. The Hoover backlash, which had been building for several years, had produced a readership divided between devotion and disillusionment. The critical establishment, which had largely ignored Hoover during the years of her independent success, had turned its attention to her work with a scrutiny that was not always fair and was not always entirely wrong. The film therefore arrived into a room where people had already decided how they felt, not about this specific adaptation, but about the larger phenomenon it represented, and that prior feeling was almost impossible to bracket entirely when watching the film. The devoted readers came with love and protectiveness and a deep investment in seeing their favorite characters honored on screen. The skeptics came with a critical posture already in place and a genuinely neutral viewer, the person who had not read the book and had no stake in the franchise, was a relatively rare category in the opening weekend audience. This matters because the Rotten Tomatoes score of 56% and the Metacritic score of 49 out of 100 do not tell you what those numbers usually tell you about a film. Those numbers do not measure the quality of the cinematic experience in isolation. They measure the reaction of critics who arrived in that room already positioned by the cultural argument around Hoover's work, and who, in several documented cases, wrote reviews that were as much about the book talk phenomenon as they were about the specific film being projected on the screen. You can see this in the critical language used about reminders of him across multiple reviews. Language that reaches for the same reference points and the same frames of dismissal. Language that is doing cultural commentary as much as film criticism. Compare that to the audience reception, a cinema score of B, with 66% of post-track surveyed audiences saying they would definitely recommend the film. There is not a negligible gap between critical and audience response. That is a meaningful divergence that tells you something real about the way cultural positioning affected professional reception of this particular film. The box office tells yet another story. Reminders of Him grossed $89 million globally against a $25 million production budget. That is a significant return. It made $8 million on its first day, including nearly $2 million in Thursday preview screenings, and opened to $18 million in its first weekend. By any conventional metric of studio filmmaking, this is a successful film. It found its audience, it held that audience, and it turned a substantial profit for Universal Pictures. And that commercial reality sits in an interesting tension with the critical response. It is the tension between what professional critics decide a film is worth and what an audience decides it needs. That tension is not unique to this film, but it is particularly sharp here because the story Reminders of Him is telling is explicitly a story about who gets to decide what a person is worth. Who gets to determine whether someone deserves another chance? Who has the authority to withhold or grant grace? The irony of that thematic preoccupation being played out in the film's critical reception is not subtle, and it is worth sitting with. Now, how did the conversation around this film diverge between critics and audiences in specific terms? The critics who responded most negatively to Reminders of Him overwhelmingly focused on the screenplay, its pacing in the second act, its compressed handling of Ledger's internal journey, its failure to fully translate Kenna's interior voice into cinematic language. These are, as I noted in the previous layer, legitimate criticisms. They are real problems in the film. But what the most negative critics frequently fail to acknowledge, or acknowledged only briefly before moving past it, is that within those structural limitations, the film contains performances and specific scenes of genuine distinction. The tendency in the negative critical response was to treat the screenplay's weaknesses as definitive of the entire experience and to dismiss the individual moments of real craft as insufficient to overcome those weaknesses. The audience response, on the other hand, appears to have experienced those individual moments as primary, as the thing the film is, rather than as exceptions within a flawed whole. Neither of these readings is entirely wrong, they are emphasizing different things. The critics who responded most positively noted Maika Monroe's performance as the film's decisive argument for its own existence, and the Rotten Tomatoes consensus, even at 56%, specifically calls out the sensitive performances as one of the film's genuine achievements. There was a convergence across the critical spectrum on Monroe's work, and this is significant because it means that even the film's harshest critics were unable to dismiss what she brought to it. When a performance generates that kind of consensus in the face of divided critical opinion about the film surrounding it, it tells you something important. The performance has transcended the film's other limitations and become the reason to watch it on its own terms. That is rare. That is what Maika Monroe has done here. And the fact that it has not generated serious awards conversation is, in my view, a genuine cultural failure. We will come back to that. On the awards front, Reminders of Him has not, as of this writing, received the kind of major awards recognition that its central performance arguably deserves. The reasons for this are straightforward and frustrating in equal measure. Films in the romantic drama genre, particularly those based on popular fiction with a predominantly female leadership, are historically undersupported by the major awards bodies. The critical establishment's mixed reception of the film effectively closed certain doors that a higher Rotten Tomatoes score might have kept open. And the timing of the release, March 13, 2026, places it early enough in the awards calendar that it risks being forgotten by the time the major bodies begin their deliberations. What the film deserved and did not receive was a serious conversation about Monroe's performance in the lead actress category at multiple awards bodies. What Lenny Wilson brought to her debut performance also deserved recognition from whatever bodies handle breakthrough film performances. The score by Tom Howe deserved to be in consideration at the various bodies that recognize original film music. None of these conversations appear to have happened with any seriousness. That is a gap between what this film accomplished artistically in its best moments and what the industry chose to acknowledge. The streaming life of this film is going to be interesting to watch. And I say this with genuine curiosity rather than a prediction I'm fully confident in. Reminders of Him is currently available on digital platforms for rental and purchase, with a Blu-ray release reportedly scheduled for December 31, 2026. When it arrives on a major streaming platform, and given its commercial performance, it will find a home relatively quickly. It is going to experience a second wave of discovery that will look different from its theatrical reception. The audience that finds it on streaming will not arrive with the full weight of the book talk cultural debate primed and ready. They will arrive simply as viewers looking for something to watch, and what they will find is a film that does not announce its quality loudly but rewards the patient viewer with moments of real emotional precision. The second wave audience for this film on streaming is going to be more diverse and less prepositioned than the theatrical audience was, and my genuine belief is that its reputation will be more nuanced and more positive as a result of that second encounter. Does it feel timeless or perfectly of its era? This is the question I find most interesting to sit with, and my honest answer is it feels like a film that is attempting timelessness through a story about permanent things, grief, guilt, parenthood, love that outlasts the person it was originally attached to, but that is also unmistakably shaped by the specific cultural moment of its production. The book talk aesthetic, the female ensemble creative team, the country music atmosphere, the careful handling of trauma without graphic representation, these are choices that reflect 2025 and 2026 sensibilities with some specificity. The core emotional argument of the film, whether a person who has done the worst thing can still deserve love and connection, is as old as storytelling itself. But the particular way this film makes that argument, the specific register it operates in, the genre conventions it deploys, and the ones it deliberately avoids. These mark it as a product of this particular cultural moment. Whether that makes it less than timeless or simply honestly of its time is a question I think each viewer has to answer for themselves. My feeling is that in 20 years, if the film is remembered at all, it will be remembered for Monroe's performance rather than for its story. The way certain performances detach from their source films and become cultural objects in their own right. That is the kind of lasting quality this film contains. It is contained in one specific person's work, and it is real. Now, let's go deeper. Because the story we have described so far, the literal narrative of what happens, the who and the where and the when, is only the surface of what this film is actually about. And this is the layer that I find most rewarding to explore, and the layer that I think the critical conversation around this film has most thoroughly failed to engage with. Here is what Reminders of Him is really about. When you strip away the romance and the custody drama and the grief and the small town social dynamics, and you look at the engine running underneath all of it, this film is about the difference between punishment and consequence. And that distinction, which sounds abstract and philosophical when stated plainly like that, is actually the lived emotional question at the center of every single scene. Let me explain what I mean. Kenna served her prison sentence. She was punished by the legal system for what she did. She completed that punishment. And then she was released, which is to say, the former process of punishment ended and she returned to her life. But what she found when she returned is that the consequences of what she did are not coextensive with the punishment. The prison sentence ended, the consequences did not. She will live with the consequences for the rest of her life. Tim will always be the child whose father is gone. The Landrys will always have lost their son. Ledger will always have lost his best friend. Kenna will always be the person who made that happen. None of that changes when the cell door opens. And the question the film is really asking, the question underneath the romance, underneath the custody drama, underneath the tears and the bar scenes and the cemetery visits, is this: once the punishment is complete, who gets to determine what the consequences continue to look like? Who has the right to extend them? Who has the authority to say that the legal system's judgment is insufficient, that the sentence was not enough, that the cost must be ongoing and permanent? This is a question with enormous contemporary relevance. The criminal justice conversation in contemporary American culture has been settling this territory for years. The question of what rehabilitation actually means, what reintegration actually looks like, what society owes to people who have completed their sentences, and what those people owe to themselves and to the people their actions affected. Reminders of Him does not engage with these questions at the level of social policy. It is not that kind of film, but it is deeply engaged with the human experience of living inside these questions, with what it actually feels like to be the person who completed the punishment and is now navigating the permanent landscape of consequence. And that engagement gives the film a moral seriousness that its surface level romance categorization does not capture. Here is where it gets layered in a way I want you to really sit with. The film presents three different models of how consequences should work, embodied by three different characters. Grace Landry represents the position that consequences are permanent, that what Kenna did removed her from the category of people who deserve a relationship with them, full stop, and that no amount of time served or personal growth can change that fundamental removal. This is a position rooted in grief, and the film is honest enough to present it not as monstrous but as understandable. Grace is not wrong that Kenna did something devastating. She is wrong. Or at least, this is what the film is arguing. In our belief that devastation entitles her to permanent punitive authority over another person's future. Patrick Landry represents the position that consequences are real but should not be permanent, that there comes a point where the people who are hurt have a responsibility to ask whether their continued withholding of connection is about protecting DM or about protecting themselves from the pain of having to integrate complexity into their grief. Ledger represents the third position, that consequences exist alongside the ongoing reality of the people living within them, and that choosing to engage with the person who caused harm is not the same as excusing that harm. It is simply choosing to continue to relate to the full complexity of a human being rather than reducing them to the worst thing they have done. These three positions are in genuine philosophical tension throughout the film, and the film does not entirely resolve the tension in favor of any single one of them. It comes closest to Ledger's position. Of course, it does. He is the romantic lead. But it never fully dismisses Grace's position or presents Patrick's evolution as a simple moral victory. The resolution the film offers is not the triumph of one position over the others, but rather a grudging, fragile, unfinished accommodation between them. And that unfinishedness is, in my view, the film's most honest quality. Because in real life, these situations do not resolve cleanly. People who cause terrible harm do not get granted redemption like a gift. They live in the ongoing negotiation of consequence, and the best they can hope for is that negotiation rather than permanent exclusion. Now think about what the film is saying to you personally, because this is the layer that connects to something you have actually felt in your own life. Most of us have not caused the death of someone we love through a catastrophic mistake, but most of us have done something that caused someone we cared about something real. Most of us have lived at some point in the particular shame of knowing that we caused harm and cannot undo it, that the apology was insufficient, that the repair was incomplete, that the person affected still carries something because of what we did. Most of us have wondered at some point whether we deserve the good things that happen to us in the aftermath of our worst moments. Whether the love offered to us after we have failed is something we are truly entitled to receive. Whether growth and regret actually entitle us to anything at all, or whether entitlement is the wrong frame entirely. Reminders of Him is a film about all of that, about what it means to accept love when you believe at your core that you do not deserve it, about what it means to receive grace from a person who has every reason not to offer it, about whether the transformation that happens inside a person who has truly reckoned with their worst act is visible enough, legible enough, sufficient enough to change the terms of their relationship to the world around them. These are not small questions. They are the questions that sit underneath an enormous amount of ordinary human experience, and the fact that they are wrapped in the genre conventions of a romantic drama does not make them less serious. It makes them more accessible, and accessibility, when it is achieved without simplification, is not a failure of artistic ambition. It is a particular kind of success. Let's also examine what the film is saying about parenthood. Because DM, the child at the center of this story, is not simply a plot mechanism. She is the physical embodiment of the film's central moral question. She is what Scotty left behind, and she is what Kenna most wants and least feels entitled to. And the film's treatment of her position in the story is consistently thoughtful in a way that the romantic drama framing might lead you to underestimate. DM is a child who has grown up in a household of grief without knowing that she is growing up in grief. She knows her father is gone. She does not know the full circumstances. She has been raised by grandparents who love her completely and who have organized their love for her around a specific version of the family story, a version that keeps Kenna out of it, not through active lying but through selective omission. And DM, being a child rather than a narrative device, is starting to ask the questions that children ask when they begin to feel the shape of the thing that is missing. Not the fact that her father is gone, she has always known that, but the fact that her mother is also absent in a way that requires explanation. And the explanation she has been given so far is not, she is beginning to sense, the complete one. What the film understands, and what the Colleen Hoover novel understood before it, is that children are not protected from grief by being kept from its full complexity. They are only protected temporarily at the cost of a later reckoning that will be harder for the additional years of silence. DM is going to have to know, and the question of how and when and in whose presence she comes to know it, that is the real custody argument at the heart of this film. It is not about whether Kenna has legal rights. It is about who is going to be present when DM eventually asks the questions that cannot be deflected anymore. The film argues, quietly but clearly, that Kenna needs to be that person. Not because Kenna deserves it, but because Diem deserves to receive that truth from someone who will carry it with love rather than with bitterness. There is also a strand of this film's deeper meaning that I want to draw your attention to, because it is there in every scene and almost no one is talking about it. This is a film about what it means to love someone through their absence, not to grieve them. Grief is in the film, certainly, but to love them. Ledger still loves Scotty. Kenna still loves Scotty. Delandry still loves Scotty. Diem is beginning to love the idea of a father she never knew. And all of these different shapes of love for the same absent person are present in every room of this story simultaneously, creating an emotional density that the film manages better in some scenes than others but never loses sight of entirely. The title, Reminders of Him, is not simply about Kenna being reminded of Scotty by the people and places of her old life. It is about the way grief works in communities, the way a loss radiates outward and touches every relationship connected to the person who is gone. Every character in this film is a reminder of Scotty to every other character. Every interaction is shaped by his absence. Casey's invisible presence in every frame, more present in his absence than many films manage to make their living characters. And that the management of an absence as a presence is one of the things this film does with more skill than it is given credit for. Alright, we have been in the deep layer long enough. Now it is time to go to the place where the film's full architecture is revealed, where the things that were hidden in plain sight become visible and the story we thought we understood shows us what it was actually doing all along. This is the part of the video where you need to have seen the film. If you have not, I need to stop you right here and tell you genuinely, as someone who thinks you should experience this story before someone else explains it to you, close this video. Go watch Reminders of Him. Come back when you are ready, because what we are about to open is the full box, and once it is open, it cannot be closed. Take the time to experience it yourself first. It will hit differently. Trust me on that. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now, go watch it, and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. The first major revelation the film builds toward, one that the novel handles with a specific structural device and the film handles somewhat differently, is the full picture of the night Scotty died. Throughout the first act and into the second, the film provides fragments. You understand that there was a car accident. You understand that Kenna was driving. You understand that she had been drinking. But the film deliberately withholds the full emotional context of that night, not the facts, which are legally less established and publicly known in the film's world, but the emotional reality. The reason the night unfolded the way it did. The specific state both Kenna and Scotty were in before they got in that car. And when the film finally gives you the complete picture of that night, not as a legal argument but as a human memory, it changes the emotional texture of everything that came before it. It does not excuse what happened. The film is emphatically not interested in excusing it. What it does is make the event fully human, fully understandable as the kind of catastrophic thing that happens not because someone is evil, but because someone is young and frightened and makes a decision in a moment of overwhelming emotion that they cannot take back. The film shows you that Kenna and Scotty were in conflict that night. Not a violent conflict, nothing of that kind, but a conflict rooted in the specific vulnerability of a relationship that was still becoming itself, still figuring out its own shape, and they were both afraid of something that might, and neither of them knew how to say so clearly. The car, the speed, the moment of catastrophic loss of control, it happened inside an emotional context that was already running too fast and too close to the edge. Knowing that does not change what happened, but it changes how you hold the person it happened to. And that shift in how you hold Kenna after you understand the full picture of that night is the film's most important single moment of storytelling. Here is what most people miss about how that revelation is structured in the film. It does not arrive in a single dedicated flashback scene. It arrives in pieces scattered across multiple scenes, each piece delivered at a moment when Kenna's present tense experience makes it emotionally relevant. The first piece arrives when Kenna is watching DM through a fence, and the camera gives you a brief fragment of what Scotty looked like in the moments before the accident. Not in the accident, not in the horrifying seconds of impact, but before. His face in the car, looking at Kenna with an expression that has both love and something unresolved in it simultaneously. The second piece arrives during the bar scene where Ledger plays her the music, and here you should notice that the song choice in that scene is not arbitrary. The song has a specific emotional valence that connects to what Kenna and Scotty were talking about in the car that night, and if you are paying close attention to the lyrics, you can hear the thematic echo. The third and final piece arrives in the scene that is formally the most unusual in the film, a sequence in which Kenna is alone and she speaks, not to another character, not in a conventional dramatic monologue. She speaks to Scotty, directly as if he can hear her, and in the space of that address, she says the thing she was trying to say in the car that night and never got to finish. What she says is not reproduced here exactly. The Finn handles it with the specific restraint of paraphrase and implication rather than direct statement, but what it conveys is the unfinished conversation of a relationship that was interrupted before it reached its resolution. And that incompleteness, the fact that Kenna and Scotty never got to finish the thing they were trying to say to each other, is the deepest wound the film is examining. It is not guilt about the accident itself, though that guilt is real and present. It is the specific grief of a conversation that will never be completed, of a relationship that ended in the middle of becoming what it was trying to be. That is the film's most psychologically precise insight, and it arrives quietly without announcement in a scene that could easily be received as simply emotional rather than structurally significant. Look close at that scene. This detail will hit differently now. The turning point in the Landry relationship, the moment when Patrick genuinely begins to move toward allowing Kenna access to DM, is triggered not by a dramatic confrontation but by something smaller and more real. It is triggered by DM asking a question. A specific question that she asks Patrick in a quiet moment at home that makes clear she has been thinking about her mother, not the idea of her mother, not the family history version of her mother that Grace and Patrick have been carefully managing, but the real person. The child asks with the specific directness of children who have not yet learned that certain questions are supposed to be avoided, and the question catches Patrick completely unprepared. He does not have an answer ready that is both honest and protective simultaneously. And in the gap between the question and the answer, in that particular helplessness of a man who has been holding a story together with enormous effort and suddenly cannot find the words, Patrick understands something he has been avoiding understanding. He cannot protect DM from Kenna indefinitely. The more he tries, the more the absence of Kenna becomes a presence that DM can feel and is already beginning to name. The question a child asks about the person who is missing is more powerful than any legal argument, any emotional appeal, any practical negotiation. DM asking is the thing that moves Patrick. Not Ledger's advocacy, though that mattered. Not Grace's eventual softening, though that came. DM asking, a child needing something that the people protecting her cannot provide. That is the real hinge of the story, and the film places it exactly right. The symbol that runs through this film most consistently, and the one most likely to be missed on a first watch, is the motif of doors and thresholds. Look at how many of the film's significant scenes are staged at, across, or in relation to a door or a visible boundary between spaces. Kenna at the fence watching DM. Kenna outside the bar before she goes in for the first time. Kenna at the threshold of the Landry house in the film's climactic sequence. Ledger standing in the doorway of a room when he makes the decision to go back to Kenna after their period of distance. Even the prison, the film's most explicit threshold, is given a visual treatment that emphasizes the act of crossing rather than the state of incarceration. Caswell is staging the story as a series of crossings, places where a character is on one side and needs to get to the other, and where the question is always whether they have the right to cross. This is not an accident. It is a visual argument that mirrors the film's thematic argument that every meaningful change in this story involves someone crossing a threshold they were not previously permitted to cross, and that the crossing is only possible when someone on the other side chooses to open the door. Grace's eventual opening, her decision, costly and hard won and visibly painful, to allow Kenna into DM's world, is staged explicitly as the opening of a literal door. And it is staged from Kenna's perspective, looking at the door before it opens, not knowing whether it will. That perspective choice is everything. You are in Kenna's position. You are on the outside looking at a door. And when it opens, you feel what she feels, which is not triumph, it is terror. Because every door she has ever walked through since the accident has led to something she was not prepared for. This one might too. The foreshadowing of Kenna and Ledger's romantic connection is planted much earlier in the film than most viewers notice on a first watch. There is a scene in the first act, before either character knows who the other truly is, where Ledger is behind the bar and Kenna sits across from him, and the camera frames them in a specific way, centered on the bar between them as a physical barrier, with both characters on their respective sides. The bar is doing the work of the fence, the door, the threshold. It is a physical object that separates two people who are going to choose to cross toward each other. And the film is showing you that crossing before it begins. There is also a piece of foreshadowing in the music. In the bar's ambient soundtrack, during one of their early conversations, there is a song playing that recurs later in a completely different context. In one of Kenna's private moments in her motel room, on a phone, half heard. The song connects those two scenes across the film's timeline and suggests that Jenna is already, without realizing it, carrying Ledger with her in a space that belongs to her most private self. Most viewers will not consciously register this connection on a first watch, but on a rewatch it is unmistakable and deliberate. The journal that Kenna keeps, the one that contains her poetry, her addresses to Scotty, her inner life, functions as the film's most significant piece of sustained symbolic imagery, and it is also the place where the film's most important hidden detail lives. Pay attention to the journal's physical appearance throughout the film. It is not the same journal in every scene. In the early scenes, it is worn and filled, a notebook that has been used for a long time, clearly predating her release from prison. This is the journal she kept while incarcerated, the record of years of private reckoning. Later in the film, after the revelation of Ledger's connection to Scotty, after the period of distance between them, she appears with a new journal, unused. Its pages are clean and blank. This is not a continuity error. This is the film's quietest and most precise piece of visual storytelling. The old journal was the record of a person living inside the past, inside the fixed landscape of what happened and what cannot be changed. The new journal is the beginning of a record that is not yet written. It is Kenna beginning, for the first time since before the accident, to imagine that she has a future worth documenting. She has not crossed the threshold yet. She has not opened the new journal, but it is in her hands. That is the film saying, without any dialogue, that something in her has shifted. Something in her has begun to believe, however tentatively and terrifyingly, that she might be permitted to continue. The film's ending, and here is the full shape of it, every element of it, arrives in a sequence of three distinct scenes that function as a triptych. The first is the encounter between Kenna and DM, which I described earlier in the walkthrough, but which deserves much fuller treatment now that we are in the spoiler space. The meeting is arranged not by legal intervention, not by a formal mediated process, but by Patrick, who tells Grace that it is time, in the particular quiet way that people communicate enormous decisions when words feel inadequate to the size of what they are saying. The meeting takes place outdoors, another threshold, another space between inside and outside, between the sheltered world and the open one. DM does not know in advance who Kenna is in relation to her. She knows this person's name. She has been told, in age-appropriate terms, that this is someone who knew her father, and DM, being the child the film has built her as, curious, unguarded, with her father's warmth and the specific gravity of a child who has grown up in the presence of adult sadness without fully understanding its source, extends herself toward Kenna with an openness that is the most devastating thing in the film. She does not know what she is giving. She just gives it. She is just a child in an afternoon with a stranger who happens to be crying very quietly and very carefully while pretending not to be. And DM, recognizing something without being able to name it, does the thing that children sometimes do when they sense that an adult is holding something too heavy. She simply moves closer. She does not ask why. She does not offer words. She just reduces the distance between them. And Monroe, in that moment, receiving that gift from a child who does not know its full meaning, is operating at a level of emotional restraint that is almost physically painful to watch. She is holding everything in. She is holding it because she has to. Because this child does not yet know the full story and it is not the right moment. And Kenna knows from a lifetime of knowing too much about wrong moments that this one must be protected. Monroe makes you feel all of that simultaneously without a single word. That is the scene, that is the performance, that is the reason this film exists. The second scene in the triptych is between Kenna and Ledger, and it is the romantic resolution of the film. What is interesting about it is what it does not contain. There is no declaration. There is no formal statement of the relationship or its future. What there is instead is a conversation about what comes next. Not in the grand sense, not in the sense of life plans and permanent commitments, but in the immediate, practical, frightening sense of what the next day looks like. And in that conversation, the film is honest about the enormous amount that remains unresolved. DM does not know yet. Grace has not fully arrived at acceptance. The part between here and anything resembling a normal family life for Kenna is immeasurably long and uncertain. Ledger and Kenna know this. They say so in the film's careful paraphrased way. They acknowledge the distance between where they are and where they would need to be, and then they choose to take the next step anyway. Not because the problems are solved, because the alternative, not taking the step, returning to the isolation that has been both their default and their punishment, is no longer acceptable to either of them. That is the right romantic resolution for this story. It is not a happy ending, it is an honest beginning. And the difference between those two things is everything. The third scene in the triptych is the one the film ends on, and it is a choice that I found both right and slightly too neat simultaneously. The final image is Kenna, alone, not with Ledger, not with DM, not with anyone. And she is writing in the new journal. She is writing something that the camera does not let you read, and the film is correct in that withholding. Her inner life, the journal says, is hers again. She is no longer only a record of what happened, she is beginning to be the record of what comes next. And the film holds on that image, her hand moving across a page in a quiet room, with the sound of the world outside the window continuing its indifferent business, and then it ends. No post-credit scene, no epilogue, just the image of a person beginning to write their own next chapter, and the understanding that how that chapter turns out is not something the film can tell you, because it is not the film's story to finish. It belongs to Kenna. And giving it back to her is, in the end, the most generous thing the film does. My personal reaction to this ending is complicated, and I want to be honest about it. In the theater, I found it move me more than I expected, given that I had spent much of the preceding hour and 54 minutes noting its weaknesses with the critical part of my brain. And then I sat in the car afterward and I thought about why it moved me despite the film's imperfections, and what I came to was this: the story it is telling is one that deserves to be told. The experience of being a person who has done something unforgivable and who is trying to find out whether life can continue, whether love can continue, whether connection can continue, whether the future has any claim on someone whose past has been defined by its worst moment, is a real human experience that is not well served by the storytelling mainstream. Most stories about people who have done terrible things resolve, either in punishment or in redemption. in the person being finally formally destroyed or in the person being finally formally absolved. This film refuses both of those resolutions. It ends in the middle, in the ongoing, in the unfinished project of a life that has not yet decided what it is going to be. And that refusal, that honest thing in the difficulty of the middle, is what I think about when I think about whether this film was worth making. It was worth making. Not because it is perfect, it is not, but because the story it is telling with imperfect tools is a story that matters, and the best version of it, the version that lives in Maika Monroe's specific performance of this character, is something genuinely worth finding. So now we have done what this channel does. We opened it, we went inside it. We examined it layer by layer. The production context, the story, the performances, the cultural moment, the hidden architecture of what it is truly saying underneath everything visible on the surface. We sat in the spoiler space and we found the things most people missed and we named them clearly. And now we arrive at the place where I have to tell you, plainly and personally, what all of that amounts to. What I genuinely think this film is worth. Not what the aggregate score says. Not what the most enthusiastic defender or the most dismissive critic would tell you. What I think after sitting with it for days, after going back over specific scenes, after holding its best moments up against its most significant failures and trying to see the whole picture clearly. This is the verdict, 6.3 out of 10. That is my honest number, and I want to spend some real time with that number because a rating only means something when you understand the reasoning behind it, and in this case, the reasoning is layered in a way that a simple fraction does not capture. So let me build the argument from the ground up. Because you deserve more than a score. You deserve to understand exactly what that score is measuring and what it is not. Here is what a 6.3 means in the specific context of this film. It means I watched something that contains a genuine 9 out of 10 performance at its center. It means I watched something that has scenes of real, lasting emotional power that I will remember long after I have forgotten the structural problems that surround them. It means I watched something that has a score that deserves more attention than it is receiving, cinematography that is doing sophisticated emotional work, and a directorial sensibility that is consistent and genuinely thoughtful even when it is working within limitations. All of that is real. None of it is overstated, and 6.3 still remains the right number because a film is not the sum of its best moments. A film is the experience of its total duration. And the total duration of reminders of him contains stretches that do not earn the attention they ask for. A second act pacing problem that is real and not minor, a romantic lead whose internal journey is compressed in ways that undermine the film's emotional logic, and a supporting cast of genuinely exceptional actors who are given insufficient material to demonstrate what they are capable of. These are not small complaints. They are structural limitations that prevent this film from being what its best moments suggest it could have been. 6.3 is not a dismissal. I want to be very clear about that. A dismissal would be a 4 or a 5, a score that says this film failed at its basic ambitions. 6.3 says this film succeeded at some of its ambitions, failed at others, and the balance between those outcomes lands on the respectful side of the ledger without reaching the genuinely impressive side. It is the score of a film I am glad exists, that I think deserves to be seen, and that I think does not fully deserve either devotion of its most ardent supporters or the contempt of its harshest critics. It is in the middle, genuinely, not as a compromise, but as an honest assessment of a film that contains both real achievement and real limitation in roughly equal measure. Let me now be specific about who should watch this film because the answer to that question is not the same for every person asking it, and giving you a single blanket recommendation would be a disservice to the specificity of what this film actually is. If you are a reader of the novel, if you have a relationship with Kenna and Scotty and Ledger and DM that was formed on the page, you should watch this film. Full stop. You should watch it knowing that the adaptation makes choices you may not agree with, that certain elements of the source material are compressed or absent, that the interior voice that gives the novel its specific power is not fully replaced by cinematic equivalents. You should watch it knowing all of that and still watch it. Because what Maika Monroe does with Kenna on screen will give you something that the page could not give you, which is the specific quality of a human face and body carrying this character's weight in real time in a way that is impossible to fully imagine before you have seen it. The film will not replace the novel in your memory, but it will add a new dimension to the characters you already know, and that dimension has genuine value. If you are someone who loved It Ends With Us as a film, if the Colleen Hoover cinematic universe, such as it is, has already found a place in your viewing life, then Reminders of Him is a more serious film than its predecessor. It is less melodramatic in the conventional sense, less inclined to a dramatic escalation and big emotional moments staged for maximum impact. It is quieter, more interior, more willing to let silence do the work that a different kind of film would fill with confrontation. If you found It Ends With Us too intense or too propulsive, you may actually find more to appreciate here. If you loved It Ends With Us precisely for its intensity, you may find this one slightly subdued by comparison. Both reactions are valid and both are worth knowing in advance. If you are a genuine film enthusiast who comes to cinema primarily for craft, if what you want is a film that demonstrates something technically or aesthetically interesting regardless of genre, then I would still recommend this film specifically because of Monroe's performance and because of the cinematography by Tim Ives. These are two elements of craft that transcend genre and deserve the attention of anyone who cares seriously about what film can do. Monroe's work here is the kind of performance you study if you want to understand how physical restraint can communicate enormous internal experience. Ives's visual language is the kind of cinematography you study if you want to understand how light and composition can carry the emotional weight of a screenplay's weaknesses without replacing them. Both of those things are worth your time and attention, regardless of whether romantic drama is your preferred genre. If you are someone who has no prior relationship with Colleen Hoover's work and no particular investment in the romantic drama genre, and you are asking whether this film will hold your attention and reward your emotional investment, the honest answer is that it probably will in its best passages, and it will probably test your patience in its weaker ones. The second act pacing issue is real enough that a viewer with no prior affection for the characters may feel it more acutely than someone who brings existing emotional investment to the table. The compressed handling of Ledger's internal journey may make the romantic relationship feel slightly less grounded than the film intends it to be, but the first act is strong enough to establish genuine interest, and the third act is strong enough to pay off the emotional investment the first act creates. If you can sit through the middle section, which has real merit even in its slower passages, the ending will mean something to you. If you are someone who engages with film primarily through the lens of social and political meaning, if you want cinema that says something significant about the world it exists in, then this film has more to offer you than its romantic drama classification suggests. The questions it is asking about punishment, consequence, redemption, and who has the authority to grant or withhold grace are questions that sit at the center of contemporary conversations about justice, rehabilitation, and what society owes to the people it has formally punished. The film does not engage with these questions at a didactic level. It does not position itself as a social commentary, and it never becomes a message film, but it is operating in that territory at the level of human experience. And if you are attentive to that dimension, it will give you material to think with long after the credits have finished. If you are a parent, and this is the category of viewer I think is most consistently underserved by the critical conversation around this film, Reminders of Him will probably hit you in a place that film criticism has not adequately mapped. The specific grief of Kenna's relationship to Diam, the love for a child that has had nowhere to go, the terror of being the person responsible for a child's loss, while also being the person that child is missing, the complicated experience of wanting to be a parent to someone you do not yet have the right to be a parent to. This will register differently if you have children than if you do not. I cannot fully explain this from the outside. But the reactions I have read from parent viewers of this film are consistently more intense and more specific than the reactions of other demographic groups, and I think it is because the film's emotional core, that specific shape of love for a child held at an impossible distance, is something that parents experience at a somatic level that criticism cannot easily account for. Now, watch it in cinema, on streaming, or on it. This is a streaming film by temperament, and I say that as a compliment rather than a dismissal, by which I mean its emotional register, its preference for intimacy over spectacle, its investment in faces and quiet moments rather than grand cinematic gesture, makes it a film that will translate exceptionally well to a smaller screen, watched in a private domestic environment. It was made to be felt rather than seen, in the spectacular sense, and feeling something is often easier in a space where you are comfortable and the only light in the room is the screen in front of you. If you have the chance to see it on a cinema screen for the first time, the experience of Monroe's performance at scale, in the specific way that a large screen magnifies subtle facial work, is worth having. But the streaming version of this film will be, I think, the version that generates the deepest and most lasting emotional connections. It is the kind of film that people will watch alone, at night, in a quiet room, and feel things they did not expect to feel. That is a particular kind of power that not every film possesses, and Reminders of Him possesses it. As for owning it, I would say this is a rewatch film for specific viewers. If you are a Colleen Hoover devotee, you will almost certainly find things on a second viewing that deepen your experience of it, particularly in the foreshadowing I described in the spoiler section, the visual motifs of thresholds and doors, the musical callbacks, and the journal detail. If you are a student of performance, you will find Monroe's work rewarding enough on multiple viewings to justify owning the film. If you are a casual viewer who found it moving but not essential, streaming is sufficient. Let me now make the case, one more time in this finally evaluative space, for the specific things this film accomplishes that deserve to outlast the critical consensus that has calcified around it. Because I think the critical record on Reminders of Him as it currently stands is not wrong exactly, but is incomplete in ways that will look more obvious with time. Maika Monroe has given one of the most technically precise and emotionally honest performances by a female lead in an American studio film of 2026, and the absence of serious awards conversation around her work here is a failure of institutional attentiveness that is frustrating to observe. The reason her performance in this specific role is technically remarkable is something I want to be clear about one final time. She is playing a character defined by the suppression of her own emotional expression, a person who has learned, through years of living in environments where her feelings were at best irrelevant and at worst dangerous, to keep what she feels hidden from public view. That kind of internal performance, emotion that is enormous, visible only in its effort to be invisible, is one of the hardest technical achievements in screen acting. The temptation for a lesser actor is always to signal the suppression, to perform the control rather than actually exercise it, to let the audience see you holding back in a way that is itself a form of showing. Monroe does not do this. She actually holds back. The control is real. And what you feel watching it is not the performance of restraint, but the presence of an actual human experience of restraint, the specific quality of a person who has become very good at not letting the world see what is happening inside her because the world has given her ample reason to become good at exactly that. This is a kind of performance that people with training notice and people without training simply feel. Both groups should pay attention to it. The film's handling of grief as a community experience rather than as an individual experience is, I think, its most genuinely original contribution to the genre it operates in. Most grief dramas center the grief of one person, occasionally two, and present the emotional landscape of that grief from the inside. Reminders of Him presents grief as a distributed phenomenon, something that radiates outward from a single event and reaches every person who was connected to the person at the center of it, changing the shape of every relationship those people have with each other as a result. That is a more accurate model of how grief actually works in real communities, and filming it with that accuracy gives the story a texture that most romantic dramas do not attempt. You are not watching one person grieve. You are watching an entire small community live inside the ongoing aftershock of a single loss, and the way those different shocks interact with each other, the way Kenna's grief and Ledger's grief and Ledger's grief and the Landry's grief and even the town's ambient impersonal grief create friction and occasionally generate unexpected moments of connection. This is sophisticated narrative territory, and the film occupies it with more intelligence than it is given credit for. Vanessa Caswill's direction, which I have treated with measured respect rather than enthusiasm throughout this breakdown, deserves one final specific acknowledgement in the context of a choice she makes repeatedly that is easy to overlook. She consistently refuses to use conventional film grammar to tell you how to feel in scenes that are emotionally ambiguous. In most studio romantic dramas, the camera's relationship to characters in emotional scenes is instructive. It moves toward the phase you are supposed to focus on. It holds the close up at the moment of highest feeling. It uses music to confirm the correct emotional response. Casri frequently does the opposite. She holds back. She frames emotionally significant moments at a slight remove. She allows ambiguity to exist in the frame without resolving it with camera movement or score. The result in some scenes is a slight flatness, a feeling that the film is not quite giving you what you want in the moment you want it. But in others, particularly in the sequences involving DM and in the final triptych of scenes, this restraint is precisely right, because the emotions involved are genuinely too complex and too fragile to be guided by conventional cinematic instruction. You need to feel them yourself. The film creates the conditions and then steps back and lets the feeling happen without directing it. That is a confident directorial choice, and confidence of that kind in a studio romantic drama, a genre that usually feels the need to hold the audience's emotional hand at every significant moment, deserves genuine recognition. The score by Tom Howe deserves one final mention because I want to be specific about something I noted earlier without fully developing. Howe's compositional strategy in this film, the choice to become quieter at moments of highest emotional intensity rather than louder, is not simply a matter of taste or restraint. It is a compositional argument about what this story is saying. The conventional film score swells at the moment of peak emotion because it is participating in the storytelling, amplifying the feeling the narrative is generating, confirming for the audience that what they are experiencing is the correct response to what is on screen. How score at its most powerful moments does something different. It withdraws. It becomes barely audible. It creates a quality of acoustic space rather than filling that space with emotion. And what that withdrawal says underneath the narrative is something like this: the feeling you are having right now is yours. It is not the music's. The music is not going to tell you how big to feel this. The space is yours to fill. That is a compositional ethic that mirrors the film's broader message about a woman who has been told for years how to be defined by her worst moment and who is, scene by scene, reclaiming the right to define herself. This course withdrawal at key moments is the music letting Kenna be her own thing. That is beautiful, and it has gone almost entirely unremarked upon in the critical conversation around this film. There is one final thought I want to share before we arrive at the verdict in its simplest, most direct form, and it is about the title. Reminders of Him. The him is Scotty, of course. Scotty who is dead, Scotty whose absence structures every relationship and every scene and every choice in the story. But on a second watch, I found myself hearing the title differently. Because every character in this story is not just a reminder of Scotty to each other. They are also, each of them, a reminder of the kind of person they want to be, or the kind of person they are afraid they cannot be anymore. Kenna is a reminder to herself of the person she was before the accident, and the person she has had to become since. Ledger is a reminder to himself of the friendship he had, and the loyalty he is now testing against a feeling he did not expect. Place is a reminder to Patrick of the love they share that exists alongside and does not erase the grief. DM is a reminder to all of them of the future that still exists. Despite everything, the ongoing life of a person who has not yet been fully shaped by the past weight. Every character is a reminder, not just of Scotty, but of possibility, of what remains even after the worst thing has happened. That is the film's deepest layer. That is what the title is actually saying. And I think that meaning, quiet, non announced, hidden in a word that seems only to gesture toward absence, is the truest thing about reminders of him. 6.3. Imperfect, occasionally frustrating, structurally uneven in its middle act, under-supported by its awards culture and more limited by its own compressed runtime than a story of this emotional complexity deserves, and also genuinely moving in its best passages, powered by one of the year's finest lead performances, operating with the moral seriousness that its genre classification does not prepare you for, and asking questions about guilt and grace and community grief that are worth the time it asks of you. A film that could have been a great one and is instead a good one, with moments of greatness inside it. A box worth opening. Every film is a box, and we opened this one together. Now, let me tell you exactly who this film is for, one final time, in the simplest and most direct terms I can offer. If you have ever done something you cannot undo and tried to figure out how to continue living as a full human being in the aftermath of it, this film is for you. If you have ever loved someone from a distance you were not permitted to close, this film is for you. If you have ever been on the other side of that, the person doing the withholding, the person who lost something and built their protection of others partly around the architecture of their own pain, this film is for you too. It does not take sides cleanly. It asks you to hold complexity. And if you are the kind of person who goes to film precisely because you want to be asked to hold something complex and real and difficult inside a story that is safe enough to hold it in, then reminders of him will give you something genuinely worth having. Who might not connect with it? If you need your emotional payoff to arrive with the full force of conventional melodrama, if you need the swelling score and the rain soaked declaration and the unambiguous resolution, this film will test your patience and possibly your investment. It is not built for that kind of catharsis. It is built for the quieter, slower, more ambiguous kind, and that kind is not for everyone. If you need your romantic lead to be fully legible at every moment, if you find emotional restraint in performance frustrating rather than compelling, Maika Monroe's Kenna may feel distant to you in ways the film never fully bridges. If you came to this specifically for the romance and have limited interest in the grief and guilt infrastructure that surrounds it, the ratio of those elements in the final film may feel imbalanced relative to what the marketing suggested you were getting. All of those reactions are fair. All of those viewers exist. And this film is probably not the right box for them. Watch it on streaming in a quiet room, ideally alone or with someone you trust enough to be moved in front of. The cinema version has its advantages. Monroe's face at scale is a specific visual experience worth having, but the soul of this film lives in intimacy, not in spectacle, and streaming is the medium built for intimacy. If the Blu-ray matters to you, if you are the kind of person who collects films the way other people collect albums, because you know you will return to specific scenes the way you return to specific scenes, the way you return to specific songs, this one has enough in it to justify a place on a shelf. The rewatch rewards are real. The foreshadowing alone is worth a second pass. 6.3 out of 10. A film I respect more than I love. A performance I love without reservation. A story that deserved a slightly longer runway to show us everything it was capable of. And a box that, despite its imperfections, was absolutely worth opening. That is my honest verdict, and honest is the only thing this channel knows how to be. Every film is a box, and we opened this one together. If you made it this far, genuinely thank you, not as a formality. As a real acknowledgement that sitting with a piece of storytelling this carefully for this long is something that takes a particular kind of commitment, and the fact that you bring that commitment here means everything to what this channel is trying to do. If this breakdown gave you something, a new way of seeing a scene, a detail that hits differently now, a reason to go back and watch it again, then hit the like button because it helps this channel reach the people who are looking for exactly this kind of conversation about film and have not found it yet. Subscribe if you want to be in the room every time we open a new box, because there are a lot of boxes left to open and every single one of them has something inside worth finding. And leave a comment below with this question, because I genuinely want to know what you think. Whose arc and reminders of him moved you most, Kenna's, Ledger's, or Patrick's, and why? Because I have my own answer, and I suspect it is not the most popular one, and I want to see where you land. The next box we are opening is one that also arrives with a devoted readership, a complicated critical reception, and a central performance that the conversation around the film has not fully done justice to. I am not going to tell you the title yet, but I will tell you this. It is a film about the specific way that memory distorts the people we love, and how we choose to live inside that distortion rather than face what is real. If that sounds like something worth unpacking, stay close. It is coming soon. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.